Good morning, everybody. Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Markovic, ambassadors, excellencies, ministers, deputy ministers, and everybody present. I bring with me warm wishes from the people of South Africa. Allow me to say, Havla Lepo. Thank you to the government and the people of Montenegro for hosting this important event, and thank you in particular for inviting me to attend. South Africa was the first country in the world to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation. I understand it was also the first to recognize intersex, or to prohibit intersex discrimination against intersex people as a ground of discrimination. That was way back in 2005. It was the first country in Africa and the fifth in the world to legalize same-sex marriages. Our Parliament has over the years demonstrated its dedicated commitment to the provisions in our Constitution, the protections guaranteed to same-sex persons. For example, we've legislated against discrimination on sexual orientation in the work environment. In 1999, we introduced the Domestic Violence Act, that classifies, amongst others, a same-sex relationship as a domestic relationship. In other words, thus qualifying to receive the same legal protection in terms of this Act. Our Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act came about in an attempt to give effect to the spirit of the Constitution, and in particular, the promotion of the equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms by every person. Through our progressive legislative framework, we're a country that has, since 2002, legalized both joint and step adoption by same-sex couples. We have equality courts which specifically deal with cases of hate speech and discrimination, and we are also very actively involved both in our region and internationally in the area of LGBTI rights. However, despite having a strong and progressive legal framework, discrimination and prejudice still exist against LGBTI persons. We find ourselves living in a country and a continent where incidents of violence against gay people still happen on a regular basis. Often the existing legal protection does not filter down to the level of everyday life. The majority of LGBTI people in South Africa and in Africa as a whole are still sidelined from accessing their rights because of stigmatization, social isolation, and discrimination. Indeed, the world over, there are incidents of hate speech, intimidation, attacks and killings on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Legislation alone cannot solve the problem. Legislation is but the first step in preventing and combating discrimination. It's often easier to put equality or anti-discrimination legislation on the statute book than to change the attitudes of prejudice. For this reason, our government has focused on practical interventions and initiatives to complement the legislation. We have established a national task team to develop a national intervention strategy on LGBTI issues and to address so-called corrective rape and other forms of violence against LGBTI persons. The LGBTI National Task Team, established by the Ministry of Justice, is an example of a highly successful integrated model comprising of stakeholders from the various sectors, relevant government departments from our justice, crime prevention and security and social clusters, non-governmental organizations, South Africa's national human rights institutions, and we have two, the South African Human Rights Commission and the Commission for Gender Equality, as well as the South African chapter of Human Rights Watch. Other international organizations, such as Amnesty International, have been invited to its meetings to present its report and findings on their most recent investigations on the issue. Through this structure, civil society actors and national human rights institutions continue to play their role as campaigners and advocates, pressing for reform, as monitors, fostering accountability within the justice and human rights sector, as disseminators and communicators of information, as educators through a number of advocacy initiatives, legal literacy initiatives, and as direct agents helping people access various services. We have sought to improve the management of criminal cases by relevant role players in the criminal justice system, and we have established a rapid response team which meets to review progress on new and pending cases in the criminal justice system. That's obviously cases against LGBTI persons. An intersectoral communication plan outlining a number of public education and communication initiatives has also been developed. This seeks to popularize intersectoral interventions aimed at addressing the violence committed against LGBTI persons, to promote partnerships amongst government, civil society, business and the media in the fight against gender-based violence, and to encourage communities to report these crimes. Hate crimes are identity crimes, directed not only at the identity of the victim, but also of the group to which they belong. A victim is thus often a symbol of a broader group of people. Currently, our South African law does not provide specifically for hate crimes in a separate piece of legislation. So the deliberate murder of a person because of their sexual orientation or the color of their skin would simply be recorded as a murder. Similarly, damage to a mosque due to hatred of the Muslim community will simply be recorded as malicious damage to property. So as a result, we have no way to assess the levels of hate crimes in South Africa, except where a particular case receives a particular media attention. In order to address this, we've implemented a policy framework on combating hate crimes, hate speech, and unfair discrimination. The framework provides that various aspects of the current legal regime governing hate crimes, hate speech, and other forms of discrimination reflect certain inadequacies. And we are about to take that policy out for public comment. But it's important to address the misconception that in the absence of specific hate crimes legislation, those who commit hate crimes will get away with it. They do not get away with it. They still face the full might of the law. Our courts are handing down appropriate sentences, and where prejudice, hatred, or bias is established, this is often found to be an aggravating factor used to impose a harsher sentence. Our experience shows that one needs good enabling legislation, in other words, legislation which promotes equality and positively unpacks various rights, but equally important that there needs to be strong criminal sanctions when discrimination or hate crimes against LGBTI persons takes place. One must also stress the importance of civil society assistance and participation. In South Africa, we've tried to include civil society every step of the way. Historically, civil society in South Africa has played and continues to play a key role in the realization of human rights and the democratization of our society. At a regional level, for the continent of Africa, we are presently in discussion with regional civil society organizations on the possibility of convening an Africa regional seminar themed, and I quote, "Finding practical solutions for violence and discrimination against persons based on sexual orientation and gender identity and/or expression." I can also advise that the resolution on protection against violence and other human rights violations against persons on the basis of their real or imputed sexual orientation or gender identity was adopted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights at its 55th annual ordinary session held in Luanda, Angola, from the 28th of April to the 12th of May last year. The resolution condemns the increasing incidence of violence and other human rights violations, including murder, rape, assault, arbitrary imprisonment, and other forms of persecution of persons on the basis of their imputed or real sexual orientation or gender identity. It specifically condemns the situation of systemic attacks by state and non-state actors against persons on the basis of their imputed or real sexual orientation or gender identity. It strongly urges states to end all acts of violence and abuse, whether committed by state or non-state actors, including by enacting and effectively applying appropriate laws prohibiting and punishing all forms of violence, including those targeting persons on the basis of their imputed or real sexual orientation or gender identities, ensuring proper investigation and diligent prosecution of perpetrators, and establishing judicial procedures responsive to the needs of victims. The issue of sexual orientation and gender identity rights in Africa often gives rise to a much wider debate, namely that of the North-South divide on human rights. It's often argued that the polarization stems from two competing approaches: namely a human rights-based approach versus a right to development approach. The Sexual Rights Initiative, a coalition of organizations from Canada, Poland, India, Egypt, Argentina, and Africa that work together to advance human rights related to sexuality, probably sums it up best when they illustrate how this, I quote, plays out politically. The global North is telling the global South what to do and to do it now. This is a terrible human rights violation, and since this is a civil and political rights obligation, and only economic, social, and cultural rights are subject to progressive realization, the resolution must be implemented immediately. The Global South responds by questioning the human rights-based approach and promoting the right to development approach under which civil and political rights are subject to progressive realization. So how do we deal with the North-South divide when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity rights? The United Nations Free and Equal Program states unequivocally that many of the laws used today to criminalize LGBTI persons are based on laws that were imposed by colonial powers in the 19th century. Anti-LGBT laws were spread throughout colonization, and while the colonies no longer exist, the sentiment that underpinned these laws still exists. Erin Amato, writing for the Wilson Quarterly about anti-LGBT laws in Africa, argues that, and I quote, "The beliefs animating these laws may be more complicated than simple, ugly homophobia." This is something which should inform discussions and debates between the North and South when it comes to issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. We simply must engage each other. For countries in Europe or elsewhere in the West, for that matter, to take a prescriptive or enforced approach will not advance sexual orientation and gender identity rights on the African continent. Only through open and frank dialogue and consultation can we ensure that sexual orientation and gender identity rights and the rights of LGBTI persons are fostered. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, it's heartening to note that the European Parliament has adopted a resolution in February of last year on the EU roadmap against homophobia and discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. I also want to commend the European Commission on its legal review prepared by the European Network of Legal Experts in the non-discrimination field on the grounds of racial and ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age, and sexual orientation in July last year. Many of you here today represent countries which helped South Africa in its struggle against apartheid. We are a free and democratic country today, in part, a large part, because of the international assistance and support from many countries, many represented here today in the fight against racial prejudice. Homophobia and racism are two sides of the same discriminatory coin. Both deny individuals their human dignity and rob them of their humanity. If the world could overcome apartheid, it can overcome homophobia. Probably the most well-known South African, our former President Nelson Mandela, once said that, and I quote, "We must use time wisely and forever realize that the time is always right to do right." The time is ripe to do right and to put an end to hate crimes and violence against LGBTI persons. Gay rights are human rights. Thank you.